In the quiet, unassuming town of Black Hollow, an ancient mansion stood at the edge of a dense forest, looming like a forgotten sentinel. Locals called it Ravenwood Manor, a place of countless whispered tales, shrouded in mystery. It had been abandoned for nearly a century, the windows shattered, the walls cloaked in ivy, and its skeletal framework creaking under the weight of years. Few dared to venture near it, but its grim allure drew the attention of outsiders, particularly those who sought thrill or answers to the strange occurrences surrounding it. One such outsider was Claire Matthews, a journalist known for her investigative work on paranormal phenomena. She had heard whispers about Ravenwood during a podcast, and her curiosity was piqued. Ravenwood isn't just haunted, the host had said, voice trembling. It consumes the souls of those who dare to enter. Claire dismissed the hyperbole but couldn't resist the story. So, with her camera, notebook, and recorder, she made her way to Black Hollow, determined to uncover the truth. Claire arrived on a chilly October evening. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the town. Black Hollow itself felt unnervingly quiet, as if the townsfolk preferred silence over idle chatter. When she checked into the only inn, the elderly innkeeper, Mrs. Doherty, eyed her luggage with suspicion. "You're not here for Ravenwood, are you?" Mrs. Doherty asked, her voice low, barely above a whisper. Claire smiled politely. "I just doing some research." Mrs. Doherty's face paled. "It's not a place for research, child. It's a place for the damned. Many have gone, but none return whole." Despite the warning, Claire felt undeterred. Stories like this were often rooted in exaggerated folklore. The manor was a 30-minute walk from the inn, but Claire decided to scout the area the next day. That night, as she reviewed her notes, a peculiar noise disrupted her concentration. A faint tapping at the window. Her room was on the second floor, overlooking a barren alley. She hesitated before approaching the window. When she pulled back the curtain, her breath caught. Nothing was there, yet the tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. Claire grabbed her recorder, hoping to capture the sound. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease creeping in. The tapping stopped abruptly. A moment later, she heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Go back." The next morning, Claire made her way to the manor. The path leading to Ravenwood was overgrown, lined with gnarled trees whose branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder as she approached, and the chirping of birds faded into silence. The gate to the manor hung ajar, its rusted hinges screeching as she pushed it open. The house loomed ahead, its facade cracked and weathered. Vines crawled up the walls like veins, and the windows seemed like hollow eyes staring into her soul. Inside, the air was heavy with decay. Dust coated every surface, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. The grand staircase in the foyer spiraled upward, its banister warped. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Claire felt a thrill of excitement. She began her investigation, taking photographs and jotting down notes. Oddly, her recorder kept malfunctioning, emitting static whenever she tried to record. As Claire explored, she noticed peculiar things. The paintings on the walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows danced across the floor, though there was no discernible source of light. In the dining room, she found an old journal lying open on the table. Its pages were filled with spidery handwriting, recounting the life of Eleanor Ravenswood, the mansion's last known occupant. Eleanor had been accused of witchcraft and ostracized by the townsfolk before vanishing without a trace. One entry caught Claire's attention. "The shadows speak to me. They promise freedom. But at what cost? I hear them even now, calling my name, whispering secrets I dare not repeat." A chill ran down Claire's spine. As she read, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Then, she heard it again, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Leave this place." Claire spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Determined to find answers, Claire ventured into the basement. The air grew damp and foul as she descended, a flashlight cutting through the darkness. The walls were lined with cryptic symbols, carved deep into the stone. At the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface etched with runes. Against her better judgment, Claire opened it. Inside was a bundle of papers and a peculiar black stone that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The papers were letters, all addressed to Eleanor. They spoke of rituals and forbidden knowledge, of summoning beings from the shadow realm. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, plunging Claire into darkness. Panic set in as her flashlight flickered and died. Then, the whispers began again, louder this time, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. You shouldn't be here. She is watching. Run before it's too late. Claire fumbled for her recorder, hoping to capture the sounds, but the device only emitted static. A cold wind swept through the basement, carrying with it a putrid stench. Claire felt something brush against her arm, though nothing was visible. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Then, she saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. It was vaguely human but grotesquely distorted, its eyes hollow and mouth stretched into a sinister grin. Who are you? Claire demanded, her voice trembling. The figure tilted its head as if amused. I am the echo of what was taken, it rasped. And you are the next offering. Before Claire could react, the shadows seemed to come alive, wrapping around her like tendrils. She struggled, but the darkness was suffocating. With a surge of adrenaline, Claire managed to break free, dropping the recorder and sprinting up the stairs. The whispers chased her, growing louder and more distorted. She burst out of the manor, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until she reached the inn. Mrs. Doherty was waiting for her, a grim expression on her face. I warned you, the old woman said. Now it has marked you. Claire demanded answers, but Mrs. Doherty would only shake her head. Over the following days, Claire tried to leave Black Hollow, but every attempt was thwarted. Her car wouldn't start, and buses mysteriously cancelled their routes. She began seeing shadows moving in her periphery, always watching. The whispers followed her everywhere, growing louder at night. They spoke of Eleanor, of the shadow's hunger, and of Claire's impending fate. One evening, unable to bear the torment, Claire returned to Ravenwood. She hoped to confront whatever dwelled there, to find a way to end the nightmare. In the basement, the black stone still lay in the chest. Claire touched it, and a surge of visions overwhelmed her. She saw Eleanor performing a ritual, binding her soul to the shadows in exchange for power. But the shadows betrayed her, trapping her spirit in the manor for eternity. Only another can take her place, the shadows whispered. Realizing the implication, Claire tried to destroy the stone, but it was indestructible. The shadows swirled around her, their whispers deafening. Weeks later, a group of thrill-seekers stumbled upon Ravenwood Manor. The next story is called The House on Hollow Hill. The road leading to Hollow Hill was an old one, cracked and scarred with age, flanked by skeletal trees that seemed to shiver even without the wind. The townsfolk whispered about the house that loomed at the crest, a decrepit mansion that had stood empty for over a century. No one knew who built it or why it was abandoned, but rumors swirled of strange lights and muffled sounds that seeped through its boarded windows in the dead of night. For journalist Claire Reeves, it was an irresistible story. Claire had made a career of debunking myths. From haunted hotels to cursed artifacts, she had exposed them all as clever hoaxes or overblown folklore. But the house on Hollow Hill was different. There were no known owners to interview, no historical records to consult, just whispers, and the chilling promise of the unknown. When the invitation arrived, a cryptic email signed only a concerned citizen. It sealed her decision. The sender claimed to have inside knowledge of the house and urged Claire to visit before it was too late. A meeting was arranged at dusk, the perfect time for the shadowed legends to come alive. Claire arrived at the base of Hollow Hill as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of red and purple. The mansion loomed above her, its broken spires cutting jagged shapes into the twilight. She parked her car near the gate and stepped out, the cool air prickling her skin. The iron gate creaked open as if welcoming her, or warning her. Claire hesitated, gripping her flashlight and a sturdy recorder she'd brought along. Just another story, she muttered to herself, stepping onto the overgrown path. The closer she got, the worse the air felt. It was heavy, like a storm was brewing, and carried a faint metallic tang she couldn't place. The mansion's windows were like dark eyes, watching her every move. A sudden gust of wind rustled the tall grass, and Claire jumped as she thought she saw a figure dart past a window on the second floor. "Calm down," she said, taking a steadying breath. She pressed forward, determined to meet her anonymous contact. The front door was ajar when she arrived. Claire frowned, shining her flashlight into the gaping entryway. Dust motes floated like specters in the beam, and the faint scent of rot wafted out. She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back. But curiosity won. "Hello?" she called, stepping inside. The foyer was a cavernous space, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and faded portraits. Claire's footsteps echoed unnervingly, and the sound seemed to stretch farther than it should. She glanced at the portraits, their subjects' faces smeared and distorted, as though someone had tried to erase them. A sudden noise, a sharp crack, made her whirl around. Her flashlight beam landed on a figure standing at the bottom of the grand staircase. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a shabby coat that might have been fashionable a century ago. "You're Claire Reeves," he said. His voice was dry, rasping, like wind scraping over a grave. "Yes," Claire replied, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "And you are?" The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "A guide, of sorts." Before Claire could respond, he turned and ascended the stairs, his footsteps impossibly silent. Against her better judgment, she followed. The upper floor was even darker than below, the windows thick with grime. The man led her to a room at the end of a narrow hallway. Its door creaked open, revealing a space that seemed untouched by time. A chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals catching what little light filtered through the room. A large table stood in the center, covered in yellowed papers and rusted keys. "What is this place?" Claire asked, scanning the room. "The heart of the house," the man replied. "It's where it all began." "Where what began?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he moved to the table and gestured to the papers. "You'll find what you're looking for here. But beware. Truths, once uncovered, cannot be buried again." Claire frowned, but she stepped closer, her curiosity overpowering her caution. The papers were handwritten, filled with detailed accounts of strange occurrences, disembodied voices, phantom figures, and shadows that moved independently of their owners. Each entry was signed with a name she didn't recognize, but the date stretched back decades, even centuries. One entry caught her attention. It described a group of 5 people who had entered the house in 1887, determined to uncover its secrets. None were ever seen again. As she read, the air around her grew colder, and she became acutely aware of the silence pressing in. She glanced up to question the man, only to find he was gone. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The man had vanished as if he had never been there. The room felt larger now, the shadows lengthening, stretching toward her like grasping fingers. She glanced at the door, half expecting him to reappear, but the hallway beyond was dark and empty. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the oppressive silence. Only the sound of her own breathing answered. Her flashlight flickered, the beam weakening. Claire cursed it under her breath, smacking it against her palm until it steadied. She focused her attention back on the papers spread across the table, determined to distract herself. If she could find some clue, anything to explain the house's eerie reputation, she could rationalize her fear. The most detailed account in the papers described the house's origins. Built in the mid-1800s by a man named Elias Barnett, The mansion had been intended as a monument to his wife, Clara, who had died tragically during childbirth. But something had gone wrong. According to the writings, Elias had become obsessed with bringing Clara back, turning to dark rituals and forbidden texts. Strange occurrences had begun almost immediately, servants vanishing, walls bleeding, and unnatural sounds emanating from the basement. One line stood out to Claire, written in a horrid, scrawling hand. "The house is alive. It feeds on us, and it is always hungry." A chill ran down her spine. She backed away from the table, her footsteps crunching on the dust-covered floor. The room seemed to breathe, the walls creaking softly, as though shifting under her gaze. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind or the natural settling of an old structure. The sound of faint footsteps above her made her freeze. Slow, deliberate, they seemed to circle directly over her head. She tilted her flashlight toward the ceiling, but it revealed only cracked plaster. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The footsteps stopped. Then, from the corner of the room, came a faint whisper. "Leave." Claire spun around, her flashlight beam darting across the room. No one was there. "Who are you?" she demanded. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave, before it sees you, before what sees me." The air around her grew icy, and her flashlight dimmed once more, the beam flickering. The walls groaned, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to resonate through her very bones. Claire's instinct screamed at her to run, but her journalistic curiosity anchored her in place. She took a cautious step toward the corner where she'd heard the voice. Her flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but she could make out a shape, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting unnaturally. "Who are you?" she asked again, softer this time. The shadow moved, elongating, its edges riding like smoke. It took on a vaguely human form, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. "Leave!" It hissed again, the sound scraping like nails on glass. "It's waking." "What's waking?" Claire whispered. Before the shadow could respond, a deafening crash came from below. The entire house seemed to shudder, and the floor beneath Claire's feet buckled slightly. The shadow recoiled, collapsing into itself and vanishing. Claire's heart pounded as she bolted for the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, she stopped dead in her tracks. The hallway wasn't the same. The walls were no longer cracked and decayed but pristine, adorned with rich wood paneling and elaborate tapestries. Candelabras lined the corridor, their flames flickering weakly as though struggling to stay lit. The air smelled of beeswax and something sweeter, cloying like decaying flowers. "Am I losing my mind?" Claire murmured, gripping the flashlight tighter. A faint melody drifted through the air, the soft tinkling of a piano. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the house. Against every instinct, she followed the sound, her feet moving as if guided by an unseen force. The music led her to a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. They opened as she approached, revealing a grand ballroom bathed in an eerie, golden glow. Chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, their light casting strange, dancing shadows across the room. And the room was full of people, or at least they appeared to be people. Men and women dressed in Victorian finery moved in slow, dreamlike circles across the floor, their faces pale and unnervingly blank. Their eyes, when they turned toward Claire, were hollow pits of darkness. "Welcome," a voice purred behind her. Claire spun around to find the man from earlier, his shabby coat now replaced with a tailored suit. He smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "What is this?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. "A celebration," he replied, spreading his arms. "And you're the guest of honor." The dancers stopped suddenly, all turning toward Claire in unison, their heads tilted in eerie synchronization, and their hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul. Claire stumbled backward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. I don't belong here." "Oh, but you do," the man said, stepping closer. The house chose you. It always chooses. The dancers began to move again, but this time, they advanced toward her, their movements jerky and unnatural. The music grew louder, more discordant, as if the piano itself were screaming. Claire turned and ran. Claire sprinted back into the hallway, her heart pounding like a war drum. The once pristine corridor warped and twisted as she ran, the walls groaning and shifting as if alive. The golden light from the ballroom dimmed behind her, replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. The dancers were following her, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Their movements were unnatural, their limbs jerking as if they were marionettes on invisible strings. The man in the tailored suit stood at the end of the ballroom, watching her flee with an amused smirk. "Run all you like," he called after her. "You'll only make it hungrier." Claire turned away and ran harder, her lungs burning. She had to find a way out, had to get back to the front door. But no matter how far she ran, the hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the same faded wallpaper and cracked sconces repeating like a grotesque loop. Her flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering out completely. She cursed under her breath, fumbling with it as the darkness swallowed her. The only sounds were her labored breathing and the faint, relentless click of the dancer's footsteps behind her. In the pitch black, Claire's hand brushed against something cold and metallic, a doorknob. She turned it and shoved the door open, slipping inside and slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving, and listened as the footsteps outside slowed and eventually stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a faint scratching began on the other side of the door. Claire backed away, gripping her dead flashlight like a weapon. The room she had stumbled into was dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. It was a study of some kind, the walls lined with towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch higher than they should. A massive desk stood in the center, its surface cluttered with papers, quills, and a peculiar assortment of objects. A rusted dagger, a small mirror cracked down the middle, and an ancient leather-bound book. The scratching at the door grew louder, more insistent. Claire's eyes darted around the room, searching for another exit. There was none. Her gaze fell on the leather-bound book. Something about it called to her, its cover etched with strange symbols that seemed to ride when she looked too closely. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward and opened it. The pages were filled with drawings and writing in a language she didn't recognize. But as she flipped through, she found something chillingly familiar. A sketch of the mansion, its spires and windows unmistakable. Below it, in English, were the words, "The house is a vessel. Do not wake it." A loud bang at the door made her jump, though it shuddered as though something heavy had thrown itself against it. The scratching was replaced by guttural growls, low and unnatural. Her hands trembled as she turned another page. This one depicted shadowy figures surrounding a single person, their hollow eyes glowing. The caption read, "The feast begins with the chosen." Claire's stomach turned. Was that what the man in the suit had meant? That she was a chosen one? Chosen for what? The door groaned under the weight of another impact, the wood beginning to splinter. Claire slammed the book shut and looked around desperately. The desk drawer caught her eye, its handle gleaming faintly in the dim light. She yanked it open and found a small revolver and a single bullet inside. Her breath hitched. It was old, its barrel tarnished, but it felt solid in her hand. A note lay beneath it, scrawled in the same hurried handwriting she'd seen on the papers in the other room. "One shot is all you'll get. Make it count." The door burst open. The creatures that entered were no longer human. Their limbs were elongated, their mouths gaping impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged teeth. Their hollow eyes glowed like embers in the dim room, locking onto Claire with unholy hunger. She raised the revolver, her hands shaking so violently she could barely aim. "Stay back," she screamed. The creatures advanced, their movements twitchy and disjointed. The first one lunged, and Claire fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. and the creature's head snapped back as it crumpled to the floor. But the others didn't stop. If anything, they seemed more frenzied, their growls turning into high-pitched shrieks that echoed painfully in Claire's ears. She backed into the desk, realizing too late that she only had the one bullet. "Damn it," she hissed, gripping the empty gun like a club. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flickering bulb. The creatures froze, their shrieks silenced as they turned their heads toward the doorway. The man in the suit stood there, his eyes gleaming in the dark. He didn't speak, but the creatures recoiled, slinking back into the hallway like scolded dogs. Claire's chest heaved as she stared at him. What do you want from me?" He stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate. "The house is awake now," he said, his voice calm, "and it has chosen you. There's no running from it." "I don't understand," Claire shouted. "You will." The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the walls of the study twisted and warped. The bookshelves collapsed inward, their contents spilling out in a cacophony of whispers. The man smiled, and for the first time, Claire noticed that his shadow wasn't his own. It stretched and writhed, far too large for his body, its edges bristling with jagged, claw-like shapes. "The house must be fed," he said, "and you, my dear, are the perfect offering."
The Forgotten Lake. The lake didn't exist on any map for years. Locals whispered of its strange appearances and disappearances, a body of water that seemed to move. Jess Cartwright had heard the tales as a child, but now, as an investigative journalist chasing leads for a new article, she was determined to uncover the truth behind the elusive phenomenon. Jess had found a faded, hand-drawn map in an antique store. Its edges were singed, and the ink seemed to shimmer faintly under light. The map's only feature was a single label, Blackvale Lake. Her editor dismissed the idea as ridiculous. A ghost lake, really, Jess? But Jess wasn't deterred. She packed her gear and drove to the marked area in the rural outskirts of Michigan. As she approached the supposed location, her phone signal faded, and the GPS froze. The forest surrounding her grew denser, the air heavy with humidity and a peculiar metallic scent. At sunset, she stumbled upon it. The lake was vast and still, the surface reflecting the bruised sky like a polished mirror. Despite the beauty, something about it felt wrong, its waters too dark, its edges too perfectly smooth. She set up camp by the shore, unaware of the horrors waiting beneath the surface. That night, Jess awoke to an unnatural stillness. The usual night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. From her tent, she saw the lake glowing faintly, casting eerie ripples of light onto the trees. She felt drawn to it, compelled to step closer. The humming grew louder, turning into whispers. Words she couldn't understand slithered into her ears, filling her mind with dread. She fled back to her tent, clutching her flashlight like a weapon, and spent the rest of the night trembling. The history of Blackvale. The next morning, Jess decided to explore the nearby woods. She found an abandoned cabin not far from the lake, its windows broken and walls covered in moss. Inside, she discovered a collection of old journals. They belonged to a man named Elias Crow, who had lived in the area in the early 1900s. Elias's entries were frantic and disjointed, detailing his obsession with the lake. He wrote of its beauty, but also its dangers, how it called to people, drawing them into its depths. He described villagers who disappeared after hearing the lake's song and claimed that those who drowned in its waters were never truly gone. One passage stood out. "The lake is alive. It feeds on the living, their souls trapped beneath the surface. Beware the drowning hour, when the sun and moon share the sky. That is when it hungers most." Jess felt a chill crawl down her spine. She looked out the cabin window and saw the lake in the distance, its surface unnervingly still. The drowning hour. Determined to capture evidence, Jess set up cameras along the lake's edge that evening. As twilight fell, she noticed something strange. The lake seemed to expand, its waters creeping closer to her camp. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when she heard it again, the hum. now louder and more hypnotic. Against her better judgment, Jess followed the sound, her flashlight cutting through the thickening fog. The whispers returned, clearer this time. They spoke her name, coaxing her forward. She reached the water's edge and saw something rise from the depths. It was a woman, her pale skin glistening under the moonlight, her hair floating like seaweed. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum. Jess hesitated, torn between fear and compassion. The woman reached out, and Jess saw the bloated, decayed flesh of her hand. She stumbled back, and the figure dissolved into the water. Suddenly, the lake erupted. Hands, dozens of them, shot out of the water, clawing at the air. Jess screamed and ran, but the whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic. Back at her camp, she reviewed the footage from her cameras. The recordings showed nothing unusual, just the calm surface of the lake. Frustrated and terrified, Jess decided to leave. But when she looked for the road, it was gone. The descent. Jess wandered through the woods for hours, but every path led her back to the lake. Exhausted and disoriented, she finally collapsed by the shore. The whispers returned, softer now, almost comforting. She felt an overwhelming urge to step into the water. As her feet touched the surface, the lake changed. The water was no longer cold, but warm, almost alive. It wrapped around her legs, pulling her deeper. Jess tried to resist, but the whispers grew louder, drowning out her thoughts. She saw visions, flashes of people from different eras, all drawn to the lake. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their faces twisted in agony. Among them, she recognized Elias Crow. The lake pulled her under, and Jess found herself in a void, surrounded by the lost souls of Blackvale. They whispered their stories, their regrets, their pain. Jess realized the lake wasn't just a body of water. It was a trap, a living entity that consumed those who dared to enter its domain. The escape, summoning every ounce of strength, Jess fought against the pull of the lake. She clawed her way to the surface, her lungs burning. As she broke free, the whispers turned to screams, furious and vengeful. Jess stumbled onto the shore, coughing up water. The lake thrashed behind her, its surface churning violently. She didn't stop to look back. She ran until she found the road, her heart pounding in her chest. When she finally reached her car, the forest was silent again. She drove away, never looking back. Weeks later, Jess tried to write about her experience, but the words wouldn't come. She avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces, terrified of what she might see. The whispers still haunted her, faint but persistent. One night, as she sat by her window, she noticed something strange in the reflection. Behind her, in the darkness, was the faint outline of a lake. The whispers grew louder.
Claire sprinted back into the hallway, and the floor beneath Claire's like a war drum, revealing the once pristine shadows and twisted as she ran. She stumbled back, the walls groaning and shifting as if alive. But the golden light from the rotting crumbled beneath her fingers, replaced by a suffocating darkness that pressed in from all sides. His smile widening as a room. She glanced over her shoulder and froze. Why me? The dancers were following her. Her voice barely hollow eyes glowing deafeningly in the dark filled the air. Their movements were unnatural. It's not about what you've done, as if they were marionettes on invisible strings. It's about what you are. The man in the tailored suit stood at the end of the house feeds on light, watching her flee with an amused on those who burn bright. Run all you like. And you, he called after her. You only make it hungrier. The shadows turned away and ran harder, clawing at her lungs burning. She kicked. She had to find a way out, but they were relentless. Had to get back to the front, pulling her closer to the gaping chasm. But no matter how far she ran, a flashlight, the hallway now stretched endlessly ahead, slipped from her hand and tumbled into the cracked sconces, repeating. The man watched her struggle with an almost flashlight satisfaction. It's been sputtering out surrender. He said, cursed under her breath. The house will take you with it as the darkness swallowed her. Claire, the only sounds were her labored breathing to give him the satisfaction, relentless click of the dancer's footsteps. She scanned the collapsing room in the pitch black, her mind racing. Claire's hand brushed against something cold, the one that warned of the house. A doorknob lay precariously on the edge of the door open. Its pages inside and slamming as if caught in an invisible wind. She leaned against the house as a vessel, chest heaving. The phrase echoed in her mind. Footsteps outside, do not wake, eventually stopped. But the house was awake now, There
and
was silence.
Claire had one last
Then,
idea.
a faint scratching
Summoning
began
every
on
ounce
the
of
other side
courage.
of the door.
She dove for the book.
Claire backed
Snatching
away,
it just as a
gripping her
desk
dead
splintered and fell into
flashlight
the
like a
void.
weapon.
The shadows
the room she
recoiled
had stumbled into
momentarily,
was dimly lit
as if
by a
sensing her
single
intent.
flickering
She
bulb
flipped
hanging
through the
from
pages
ceiling.
with trembling
It
hands,
was a study of some
searching
kind.
for anything.
The walls
Any
lined with
spell,
towering bookshelves
incantation,
that seemed to
or
stretch
ritual
higher
that
than
might
they should.
stop the nightmare.
A massive desk
There,
stood in the center.
near the end,
its surface
she
cluttered
found
with
it,
papers,
a ritual
quills,
of binding,
and a peculiar
written in the
assortment
same
of
ancient
objects.
script.
A rusted
The
dagger,
symbols pulsed
a
on the
small
page,
mirror cracked down
glowing
the middle,
faintly,
and an ancient
she didn't
leather-bound
understand
book.
the words.
The scratching
but
at
something
the door
deep
grew
inside
louder,
her,
more
instinct or
insistent.
desperation.
Claire's
urged
eyes
her to
darted
speak
around
them
the
aloud.
room.
She
Searching
began
for
to
another
chant.
exit.
Her
There
voice
was
shaky
none.
but growing
Her
stronger
gaze
with each
fell
word.
on the leather-bound book.
The shadows hissed.
Something about it called
Riding
to
in
her.
agony as
Its
the air
cover
grew
etched
thick
with
with
strange
energy.
symbols that
The man's
seemed to
smile
rise when
faltered
she
for the
looked
first
too
time.
closely.
His eyes
Against her
narrowed.
better judgment.
Stop. She stepped
He
forward
commanded.
and opened it. His voice
The
booming.
pages were filled
You
with
don't know
drawings
what
and
you're
writing
doing.
in a language
Claire
she didn't
ignored him.
recognize.
Her
But
voice
as she
rising
flipped
above
through,
the chaos.
she found something
the words
chillingly
poured from
familiar.
her lips.
A sketch
Each
of the
syllable
mansion,
resonating with a
its
power
spires
she
and
couldn't
windows
explain.
unmistakable.
The shadows
Below
began
it,
to retreat.
in English,
Sucked back
were
into
the
the
words,
chasm as if
"The
pulled
house
by
is
an
a vessel.
invisible force.
Do not wake
The
it."
walls of
A
the
loud
room
bang at the
solidified.
door made her
The
jump.
tremor
The
subsided.
wood shuddered as though
The man
something heavy
snarled.
had thrown itself
His calm
against it.
demeanor
The
unraveling.
scratching was
Do
replaced
you
by
think you
guttural
can
growls.
fight the house?
Low
It is
and
the
unnatural.
darkness.
Her
It will
hands
consume
trembled
you.
as she turned another
Claire's
page.
voice wavered,
This
but didn't
one
stop.
depicted shadowy
The symbols
figures
in the book
surrounding a
burned
single
brighter.
person,
and the
their
room
hollow
itself
eyes
seemed to
glowing.
rebel against
The
the
caption
man's
read,
presence.
"His
The
shadow
feast begins
flickered
with
and
the
twisted.
chosen.
Claire's
Breaking
stomach
apart
turned.
like smoke caught
Was
in a
that what
gale.
the man in the
He
suit
stumbled
had meant?
backward.
That she
His
was
form
the chosen
shimmering.
one?
This isn't
Chosen
over.
for what?
He spat.
The door groaned
voice
under the weight
distorted.
of another
The
impact.
house always gets
the wood
what it
beginning to
wants.
splinter.
With a
Claire
final
slammed the book
guttural
shut
scream.
and looked around
He was
desperately.
pulled into the
The
abyss.
desk drawer
The
caught
chasm
her eye.
snapped shut
its
behind
handle
him,
gleaming faintly
leaving
in the
only
dim light.
silence.
She yanked
Claire
it open
collapsed
and
and
found
found
a small revolver
the book
and a
falling
single
from her
bullet
hands.
inside.
The room
Her
was
breath
still
hitched.
now.
It was
the air
old,
heavy with the
its
scent
barrel
of burnt wood
tarnished,
and ash.
but it felt
She
solid
didn't know
in her
how
hand.
long she lay
A
there.
note lay beneath
her body
it,
trembling and
scrawled
her mind
in the
racing.
same hurried
But
handwriting
eventually,
she'd seen on the papers
she
in the
forced
other
herself
room.
to her feet.
One shot
The
is
study
all
was
you'll
intact
get.
again.
Make it
as
count.
though nothing had happened.
The door burst open.
The door creaked open.
The creatures
revealing
that
the
entered
familiar,
were no longer human.
decayed hallway
Their
beyond.
limbs were elongated.
The house was eerily
Their
silent.
mouths gaping
Claire
impossibly
didn't wait
wide,
to see if it would
filled
change
with
its
rows
mind.
of jagged
She
teeth.
stumbled out of
Their
the study,
hollow eyes
down
glowed
the
like
hallway,
embers in the dim room,
and toward the front
locking
door.
onto Claire with
This
unholy
time,
hunger.
It
She
opened
raised the
without
revolver.
resistance.
Her
Spilling
hand
her
shaking
onto the
so
overgrown
violently
lawn.
she could barely aim.
The night was clear
Stay
and
back,
still.
she
The
screamed.
stars above
The
seemed
creatures
impossibly
advanced,
bright.
their
and the chill
movements
air bit at
twitchy
her
and
skin.
disjointed.
She turned
The
back
first
to
one
look at the
lunged,
house,
and
its
Claire
dark
fired.
windows staring
The
back
sound
at her
was
like
deafening
empty
the
eyes.
enclosed space.
For a moment,
And the creature's
she
head
thought she
snapped
saw
back as it
movement.
crumpled to the floor.
Shadows flitting
But
just
the others
behind the
didn't
glass.
stop.
If
Then,
anything,
the front
they
door
seemed more
slammed.
frenzied.
Weeks later,
their growls turned
Claire
into
sat at her
high-pitched shrieks
desk,
that echoed painfully
staring at
in
the
Claire's
draft of her
ears.
article.
She backed
She had
into the
written
desk,
and rewritten it
realizing
dozen
too
times.
late that she
But the
only had
words
the one
never
bullet.
felt right.
Damn it! How could she explain
hissed,
what had happened
gripping
in
the
that
empty
house?
gun like a club.
How could she make
A sudden
people
gust
believe
of
her?
wind swept
Her
through the room,
recorder had captured
extinguishing
nothing
the
but static.
flickering bulb.
The pages
The
she had
creatures
taken
froze.
from the study were
Their
blank.
shrieks silenced
The
as they
strange
turned their
symbols
heads
gone.
toward the doorway.
Even the book, the man
which
in
he
the
had
suit
clutched
stood
to her
there,
chest as she fled.
his eyes gleaming
was
in the
now
dark.
nothing more than
He
an
didn't
old,
speak,
empty
but the
journal.
creatures recoiled.
The house had erased
slinking
itself,
back into the hallway
leaving
like
her with
scolded
nothing but
dogs.
memories.
Claire's
and
chest
nightmares.
heaved as she stared.
Claire
at him.
sighed.
What?
Closing her
What
laptop.
do you want from
She
me?
had survived.
He stepped inside,
but she knew the house
his
wasn't
movement
finished.
slow and deliberate.
It was still out
The
there,
house is awake
waiting
now,
for its next
he
guest.
said.
His
And she
voice
feared
calm.
it wouldn't stay
And it has
quiet for
chosen
long.
you.
There's no running from it. I don't understand. Claire shouted. You will. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the walls of the study twisted and warped. The bookshelves collapsed inward, their contents spilling out
out in a cacophony of whispers. The man smiled, and for the first time, Claire noticed that his shadow wasn't his own. It stretched and writhed, far too large for his body, its edges bristling with jagged, claw-like shapes. "The house must be fed," he said, "and you, my dear, are the perfect offering." The next story is cold. The house that ate dreams. The mansion at the end of Ashfern Road had been abandoned for over a century, a brooding silhouette against the gray sky. Its windows stared like hollow eyes, its facade cloaked in vines that writhed and twisted as if alive. The locals in Mill Haven whispered about the house, calling it cursed, haunted, and evil. It wasn't hard to believe. Over the decades, the place had earned its reputation. Disappearances, strange noises, and inexplicable lights had all been tied to the decrepit structure. Children dared each other to run up to its rusted gate, touch it, and flee before the house got them. But no one stayed long near the mansion. Not until Emily Hart arrived. Emily wasn't a local. She'd come to Millhaven for a fresh start. She was a struggling artist looking for cheap rent and isolation to reignite her creativity. The small, tight-knit town seemed perfect. Quaint streets, friendly faces, and a pace of life so slow it bordered on stagnant. When she first heard about the mansion on Ashfern Road, she felt a tug of curiosity. The landlady at her boarding house was quick to dismiss her interest. "That place isn't fit for living," Mrs. Cummings said, her plump face pinched with disapproval. "Not unless you like things that creak and crawl in the night." But Emily wasn't deterred. She was more amused than frightened by the town's superstition. Surely the stories were just a way to keep kids from trespassing. If anything, the house sounded like the perfect muse for her art. Decaying architecture, gnarled trees, shadows that played tricks on the mind. She couldn't resist. Chapter 1. Entering the Beast. The air felt colder as Emily stood before the mansion. The rusted gate groaned as she pushed it open, the sound echoing down the empty street. The overgrown garden beyond was wild and untamed, the weeds tall enough to brush her knees as she walked. When she reached the front door, she paused. The wood was warped and splintered, but the knocker, a brass ring shaped like a snarling wolf, was intact. Its eyes seemed to follow her as she raised her hand to touch it. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The interior smelled of mildew and rot, but there was a strange warmth to the air, as if the house had been waiting for her. Dust motes danced in the faint light that seeped through the grimy windows. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and cobwebs hung like lace from the ceiling. Despite the decay, Emily was enthralled. The high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and stained glass windows hinted at the mansion's former glory. It was a place of secrets, a canvas waiting to be captured. "This'll do," she muttered to herself, her voice swallowed by the vast, silent space. That night, she set up her easel in the grand parlor, a cavernous room dominated by a marble fireplace. She began to sketch, letting the shadows and shapes around her guide her hand. At first, the work came easily, but as the hours ticked by, she began to feel uneasy. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made her ears strain for sound. She swore she heard footsteps upstairs, but when she ventured up the creaking staircase, she found nothing but dust and empty rooms. The unease didn't stop her, though. If anything, it fueled her creativity. By the end of the week, she'd filled her sketchbook with haunting images. The twisted vines outside, the cracked walls, the way the shadows in the hall seemed to stretch and shift when she wasn't looking. But then the dreams began. They started as fragments, dark hallways, whispers she couldn't quite understand, and glimpses of figures lurking in the corners of her vision. Each morning, she woke feeling more exhausted than the last, as if she hadn't truly slept. One night, she dreamed of the parlor. Her easel stood in the center of the room, but the canvas was blank. A figure stood beside it, watching her. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. When she tried to speak, her voice was a choked whisper, like she was underwater. The figure raised a hand and pointed at the canvas. When she woke, she found the parlor exactly as it had been in her dream, except for one thing. Her latest sketch, which she distinctly remembered leaving unfinished, was now complete. This next story is The Silence Beneath. It began with a noise, a dull, echoing hum that vibrated through the walls of the old mining town of Ashford Hollow. Nobody could quite place where it was coming from, but everyone heard it. Some dismissed it as a groaning of the earth, tectonic plates shifting far below their feet. Others claimed it was the cry of a creature long buried, finally stirring. Whatever it was, the sound persisted, growing louder every night. Ashford Hollow wasn't much to look at. a forgotten town nestled in a valley surrounded by blackened pines. Its history was steeped in coal mining, a livelihood that had dried up decades ago, leaving behind a patchwork of abandoned shafts and collapsing tunnels. The mine had been the town's lifeblood, but now it served as a graveyard for a generation that had moved on or vanished entirely. Jenna Moran hadn't planned on returning to Ashford Hollow, but her father's sudden passing left her no choice. The old man had been stubborn, refusing to leave the family home despite its crumbling foundation and the eerie isolation of the woods that encroached on all sides. The house was exactly as Jenna remembered it, grey and sagging, with shutters that clattered in the wind and a porch that groaned under the weight of even the slightest step. She spent the first day cleaning out the clutter, sorting through yellowed newspapers and boxes of forgotten trinkets. It wasn't until night fell that she heard it, the hum. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the result of too many hours alone in a house steeped in memories. But as she sat on the edge of her childhood bed, the sound grew louder, filling her ears with its low, resonant vibration. It seemed to come from the earth itself, rising through the wooden floorboards and into her bones. Jenna's sleep that night was restless, plagued by vivid dreams of tunnels that spiraled endlessly downward, their walls pulsing with an unnatural light. She woke in a cold sweat, the hum still faintly audible in the pre-dawn silence. The next day, she ventured into town, hoping for answers. The Ashford Hollow she remembered had been lively, its streets filled with the chatter of miners and their families. Now, it was a ghost town. A few scattered residents lingered, faces she recognized, aged and weary. When she asked about the hum, they exchanged uneasy glances, their voices dropping to hushed whispers. "It's the mine," said old Tom, a man who had been a fixture of the town since before Jenna was born. His voice was gravelly, his eyes bloodshot. "Something's waking up down there. We've all heard it, but nobody talks about it. Not anymore." "What do you mean, waking up?" Jenna pressed, her stomach twisting into knots. Tom shook his head. "You'd do best to leave it alone, girl. Some things are better left buried." But Jenna couldn't leave it alone. The hum was getting louder, more insistent, and she felt its pull deep within her. It wasn't just a noise, it was a calling. This next story, the unease from her conversation, the silence beneath Tom clung to Jenna. It began with a noise back to the house. A dull, the sky had grown overcast through the walls of the old mining town in shades of grey. Nobody could quite place where it was coming from, vibrating in the soles of her feet as she stepped onto the sagging groaning of the earth. She spent the afternoon researching far below their feet, combing through her father's collection of old documents and journals, long buried. He had worked in the mine before it closed. Whatever it was, like most of the men in town, the sound persisted. Among the growing louder every night. Jenna found a brittle map of the mine's labyrinthine tunnels. A forgotten town nestled in a valley surrounded by blackened pines was circled in red. Its history was steeped in coal mining, beside a livelihood that had dried up decades ago. Her father had never been patchwork of abandoned shafts. For him to write such a word was unsettling. The mine had been the Jenna stared at the map, but now it served tracing the graveyard for a generation. The hum seemed to grow louder in response. Jenna Moran hadn't planned on returning to Ashford that night. But Jenna her father's sudden passing left her no choice. She was standing at the mouth of the old man had been stubborn. The darkness inside pulsating like a home despite its crumbling foundation. A voice echoed from the eerie isolation, low and distorted, encroached on all whispering sides. Her name. The house was exactly as Jenna remembered it. The hum now a full vibration that shook the house. Shutters that clattered in the wind. She had to see for herself. That groaned under the weight of the path to the mine was overgrown. She spent the first day cleaning out railway tracks, barely sorting through yellow newspapers and boxes of forgotten trinkets. The forest pressed on until night fell that its she twisted heard trees casting skeletal shadows. At first, Jenna carried a flashlight in a backpack with the result of too many hours alone just in a house steeped in memories. The mine's entrance, but as she sat on the edge of its rusted gates hanging open, the sound like the jaws of the beast. Filling a faded sign above the entrance, Red Ashford Hollow Mining Company. It seemed to come from the earth itself. The hum was deafening now, wooden floorboards emanating from the depths of the earth. Jenna hesitated, restless, fear prickling her skin. By vivid dreams of she thought of her father and the word he'd written on the map. Their walls cursing with an unnatural but something deeper than she woke in a cold sweat. Inside, still faintly the mine was damp and suffocating. Her flashlight beam danced across the town,
hoping
Illuminating
for answers. pickaxes
The
left
Ashford
rust and
Hollow, she
broken
remembered,
carts
had
filled
been
with
lively.
crumbling rocks.
Its streets
The deeper
filled
she
with the chatter
went,
of miners,
the
and
louder
their
the hum
families.
grew,
Now,
resonating in her
it was
chest.
a ghost town.
Shaft 12
A few
wasn't hard to
scattered
find.
residents lingered.
It was blocked off
Faces
by a
she
makeshift
recognized,
barrier of wooden
aged
beams and
and
warning
weary.
signs that
When
we
she
do
asked
not
about
enter.
the hum,
The air
they
around
exchanged
it was
uneasy
colder.
glances.
The hum
Their
almost
voices
unbearable.
dropping to hushed whispers.
Jenna climbed over the
It's the
barrier.
mine,
her
said old
breath
Tom.
hitching.
A
The
man
shaft
who had
sloped
been a
downward,
fixture of the town
its
since
walls
before Jenna
narrowing
was
as she
born.
descended. His voice
Her
was
flashlight
gravelly.
flickered. His
The
eyes
shadows
bloodshot.
around her seemed to
Something's
shift
waking
and
up
writhe.
down there. She didn't
We've
know
all
how
heard
long
it.
she walked,
But nobody
time
talks
seemed
about
to
it.
stretch and distort.
Not anymore.
Her sense of
What do you
direction
mean?
slipping away.
Waking up,
The hum
Jenna
became
pressed.
a voice.
Her stomach
Its
twisting
whispers
into
incoherent,
knots.
but filled
Tom
with an
shook his head.
undeniable urgency.
You do best
At
to leave
last,
it alone.
She
Go.
reached an open
Some
chamber.
things are better
The
left
walls
buried.
were lined with
But
veins
Jenna
of a
couldn't
strange,
leave it alone.
glowing
The hum
mineral
was
that
getting
pulsed like
louder,
a heartbeat.
more insistent.
In the center of the chamber,
she
was
felt
a
its
massive
pull
pit.
deep within her.
Its edges jagged.
It wasn't
and
just a
uneven.
noise. The hum
It was a
emanated from
calling.
its depths. A siren call that sent shivers down Jenna's spine. She approached the edge, peering into the darkness. Something moved below, slow and deliberate, a shifting mass of shadows and shapes. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand but somehow felt in her mind. Come closer. Jenna staggered back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows in the pit rose higher, coalescing into a form that was both human and not. A figure with hollow eyes and too many limbs, its body shimmering with the same light as the walls. You have come, the voice said, no longer a whisper but a deafening roar. Jenna screamed as the figure lunged upward, its limbs stretching impossibly far. She turned and ran, the hum now a cacophony that filled the entire mine. The walls seemed to close in around her, the tunnels shifting and collapsing. She didn't remember how she made it out, only that she stumbled into the forest gasping for air, her clothes torn and her flashlight shattered. The hum was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. Back in the house, Jenna locked the doors and windows, her hands shaking. She tried to convince herself it had been a hallucination, the result of stress and too many sleepless nights. But she couldn't forget the way the shadows had moved, the way the voice had felt inside her head. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Objects in the house moved on their own, doors opening and closing, lights flickering. At night, she heard footsteps in the hallway, even though she was alone, and the hum returned, faint but insistent, as if it was calling her back. The townsfolk grew more distant, their eyes filled with fear when they saw her. Old Tom refused to speak to her, slamming his door in her face. One night, as the hum reached a fever pitch, Jenna saw them, the shadows. They spilled from the corners of her room, twisting and writhing like smoke. The figure from the pit emerged, its hollow eyes fixed on her. You belong to us now, it said. Jenna backed into the corner of her bedroom, clutching a rusted fireplace poker she had found in her father's tool shed. The figure from the pit loomed over her, its shadowy limbs stretching across the walls like ink spilling over paper. What do you want? Jenna screamed, her voice cracking. The creature tilted its head, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. You were chosen long ago, it said, its voice resonating deep within her skull. Your bloodline carried the mark. The silence beneath has always called to you. Jenna's breath hitched. What are you talking about? The figure leaned closer, its amorphous form seeming to flicker and pulse like the walls of the mine. Your father knew. He tried to run, but the hollow never lets go. The mine is alive, and it demands a keeper. No, Jenna whispered, shaking her head. This is a nightmare. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the hum returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It resonated through her body, each vibration clawing at her sanity. You will come back, the figure said. You cannot escape the silence. With that, the creature dissolved into darkness, its form splintering into hundreds of writhing tendrils that seeped into the cracks of the house. The hum faded, leaving an oppressive stillness. Jenna sat there for hours, too terrified to move. The next day, Jenna packed a bag and drove to the nearest city, abandoning the house and its lingering shadows. She rented a small apartment and took a job as a waitress, trying to rebuild her life. But the hum followed her. It started faint, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing day. Objects in her apartment began to move again. Books falling from shelves, chairs scraping across the floor. She heard whispers in the night, voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Desperation drove her to research the history of Ashford Hollow and its mine. She discovered reports of disappearances dating back to the 1800s, stories of miners who ventured too deep and never returned. Legends spoke of a cursed shaft, a gateway to something ancient and insatiable. The name Shaft 12 appeared again and again, always tied to death and madness. One article mentioned a ritual, a way to seal the mine and quiet the hum. But it required a sacrifice. Jenna returned to Ashford Hollow one last time. The town was emptier than ever, its streets deserted. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through the ground as she approached the mine. She carried a lantern, a bag of salt, and a knife. Inside, the mine felt alive, its walls pulsing with the same eerie light she had seen before. The shadows moved of their own accord, guiding her toward Shaft 12. The pit was waiting for her, its depths writhing with darkness. The figure emerged again, its form shifting and growing. "You have come," it said, its voice dripping with triumph. Jenna stepped forward, clutching the knife. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was firm. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady. She slashed her palm, letting her blood drip onto the ground. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing. Jenna sprinkled the salt in a circle around the pit, reciting the words she had memorized from the ritual. The hum grew louder, shaking the entire chamber. The figure screamed, its form splintering and collapsing into the pit. The light from the walls flickered and dimmed as the shadows were pulled into the abyss. The ground beneath Jenna's feet began to crumble. She turned to run but stumbled, her ankle twisting. She crawled toward the tunnel, the pit's pull growing stronger. "You cannot leave," the figure roared, its voice echoing in her mind. Jenna reached the edge of the circle and collapsed, her body shaking. Behind her, the pit imploded, sending a shockwave through the mine. The hum stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was silence. Jenna woke in a hospital bed, her body battered but alive. The police told her she had been found at the entrance to the mine, unconscious and covered in dirt. She moved to a new town, far from Ashford Hollow, and tried to forget. But the silence haunted her. It wasn't the comforting stillness she had craved. It was heavy, oppressive, a reminder of what lay beneath. Months later, she heard the hum again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The silence was never truly gone. It was only waiting. Jenna backed into the corner of her bedroom, clutching a rusted fireplace poker she had found in her father's tool shed. The figure from the pit loomed over her, its shadowy limbs stretching across the walls like ink spilling over paper. "What do you want?" Jenna screamed, her voice cracking. The creature tilted its head, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You were chosen long ago," it said, its voice resonating deep within her skull. "Your bloodline carried the mark. The silence beneath has always called to you." Jenna's breath hitched. "What are you talking about?" The figure leaned closer, its amorphous form seeming to flicker and pulse like the walls of the mine. "Your father knew. He tried to run, but the hollow never lets go. The mine is alive, and it demands a keeper." "No," Jenna whispered, shaking her head. "This is a nightmare." The figure didn't respond. Instead, the hum returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It resonated through her body, each vibration clawing at her sanity. "You will come back," the figure said. "You cannot escape the silence." With that, the creature dissolved into darkness, its form splintering into hundreds of writhing tendrils that seeped into the cracks of the house. The hum faded, leaving an oppressive stillness. Jenna sat there for hours, too terrified to move. The next day, Jenna packed a bag and drove to the nearest city, abandoning the house in its lingering shadows. She rented a small apartment and took a job as a waitress, trying to rebuild her life. But the hum followed her. It started faint, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing day. Objects in her apartment began to move again. Books falling from shelves, chairs scraping across the floor. She heard whispers in the night, voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Desperation drove her to research the history of Ashford Hollow and its mine. She discovered reports of disappearances dating back to the 1800s, stories of miners who ventured too deep and never returned. Legends spoke of a cursed shaft, a gateway to something ancient and insatiable. The name Shaft 12 appeared again and again, always tied to death and madness. One article mentioned a ritual, a way to seal the mine and quiet the hum. But it required a sacrifice. Jenna returned to Ashford Hollow one last time. The town was emptier than ever, its streets deserted. The hum was deafening now, reverberating through the ground as she approached the mine. She carried a lantern, a bag of salt, and a knife. Inside, the mine felt alive, its walls pulsing with the same eerie light she had seen before. The shadows moved of their own accord, guiding her toward Shaft 12. The pit was waiting for her, its depths writhing with darkness. The figure emerged again, its form shifting and growing. "You have come," it said, its voice dripping with triumph. Jenna stepped forward, clutching the knife. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was firm. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady. She slashed her palm, letting her blood drip onto the ground. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing. Jenna sprinkled the salt in a circle around the pit, reciting the words she had memorized from the ritual. The hum grew louder, shaking the entire chamber. The figure screamed, its form splintering and collapsing into the pit. The light from the walls flickered and dimmed as the shadows were pulled into the abyss. The ground beneath Jenna's feet began to crumble. She turned to run but stumbled, her ankle twisting. She crawled toward the tunnel, the pit's pull growing stronger. "You cannot leave," the figure roared, its voice echoing in her mind. Jenna reached the edge of the circle and collapsed, her body shaking. Behind her, the pit imploded, sending a shockwave through the mine. The hum stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was silence. Jenna woke in a hospital bed, her body battered but alive. The police told her she had been found at the entrance to the mine, unconscious and covered in dirt. She moved to a new town, far from Ashford Hollow, and tried to forget. But the silence haunted her. It wasn't the comforting stillness she had craved. It was heavy, oppressive, a reminder of what lay beneath. Months later, she heard the hum again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The silence was never truly gone. It was only waiting,